The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and old coffee, but I barely noticed the sting in the air. Thai Lin lay behind the surgery doors, and every tick of the clock dragged like wet footsteps. My clothes clung to my skin, soaked from the storm, but I refused to leave my chair. A nurse walked past with a clipboard, eyes tired, and offered a quiet promise of updates soon. I nodded, though my heart was pounding loud enough to drown her words. When the doctor finally emerged, her voice was calm, steady, and terrifying all at once. "The operation went well, but recovery will take time," she said, and my knees nearly buckled. I followed the gurney until the doors stopped me, watching my sister disappear into the bright corridor. Only then did I check my phone, screen lit with unanswered calls and messages from Elias. He wrote about dinner, about his parents waiting, about me making a scene by ignoring him. I typed a reply, erased it, then stared at the cold hospital floor instead. By the time I returned home, the rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with silence. The lights in the living room were off except for a single lamp, casting long shadows on the wall. Elias sat on the couch, his posture straight, his eyes unreadable in the dim glow. "You didn't even call," he said softly, but the softness cut sharper than any shout. I told him about the surgery, about fear, about holding my sister's hand until dawn. He nodded once, then leaned back like he was measuring the weight of my words. "My family waited," he said. "You made your choice tonight." The space between us widened, filled with things neither of us knew how to say. I walked past him to the kitchen, my shoes leaving faint wet prints on the wooden floor. The walls that once felt warm now pressed in like strangers, unfamiliar and cold to the touch. From the sink, I could see his reflection in the dark window, still and silent as stone. A part of me wanted to apologize, to fix it, to make it all small and simple again. But another part whispered of hospital lights, trembling fingers, and the promise I made. That part told me some choices define more than a night. They reveal who we stand beside. Elias came to the doorway, arms crossed, voice tighter than before. "If this is how it's going to be, we need to talk about priorities." I didn't answer, because I finally understood that his priorities and mine were no longer the same. The storm outside had ended, but the one inside our house had only just begun. Morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and pale, but the house still felt cold. Elias sat at the dining table, scrolling through his phone, barely looking up when I entered. He didn't ask about my sister, didn't ask how I had slept on the hospital chair. Instead, he asked if I had called his mother to apologize for missing dinner. I stood still, the quiet between us sharp enough to draw blood. "She could have gone blind," I said, voice steady but thin like glass about to crack. He sighed, as if I were a child refusing to understand a simple rule. "I know you care about her, but families make sacrifices," he said, eyes still on his screen. "Your sister has a wife. She didn't need you there like a nursemaid." The words hit harder than the storm from the night before. I sat down, hands trembling in my lap, wondering when love started to feel like a cage. He finally put the phone down and looked at me with practiced calm. "We're getting married soon," he reminded me, "and marriage means priorities." I thought of Thai Lin's hand in mine, shaking, desperate, searching for comfort. I thought of my own heart, torn between expectations and truth. Elias reached across the table, touching my fingers lightly. "You're emotional right now. Once things settle, you'll see I'm right," he said. I pulled my hand away before I could stop myself. His expression hardened, something cold flickering behind his eyes. "You can't keep choosing your family over us, not if you want this to work." I didn't answer because I wasn't sure what us meant anymore. Days passed in a quiet that didn't heal, but slowly suffocated. He stopped kissing my forehead in the morning. He stopped leaving notes on the fridge, with smiley faces and weekend plans. Silence became another resident in the house, sitting between us at dinner. One evening, he found me on the porch, staring at the dark sky. "You can't keep avoiding this conversation," he said, arms crossed tightly. His voice was calm, but each word was a stone. We need rules, boundaries. I won't let your sister's problems control our life. It was the first time he called her problems, not family. Something inside me shifted, quiet but irreversible, like ice cracking beneath a boot. I turned to him, searching his face for the man I once loved. All I saw were walls, where windows used to be. Before I could speak, my phone buzzed with a message from Lan. Just 3 words, "Are you okay?" I stared at the screen, unable to type an answer. Elias stepped closer, voice low, controlled. "If you marry me, you marry my family first. That's how it works." The porch light flickered above us, casting uneasy shadows on his face. I whispered, "And who marries mine?" He didn't answer, and the silence felt like the final nail in a closing door. Lan met me at a small cafe that smelled of cinnamon and rain-soaked wood. She listened without interrupting, her coffee growing cold between her hands. When I finished speaking, she didn't offer pity, only quiet truth. "You don't have to stay where you're shrinking," she said, eyes steady on mine. Her words sank into me like seeds, finding soil they'd been waiting for. That afternoon, she gave me the number of a lawyer she trusted. My hands shook as I dialed, half-hopping no one would answer. But a calm voice picked up, and suddenly everything felt possible and terrifying. 2 days later, I sat in the lawyer's office, surrounded by old books and peeled leather chairs. She adjusted her glasses and flipped through the deed of my grandmother's house. "This property is solely in your name," she said, tapping the paper. "No legal claim belongs to him, regardless of your engagement." My breath caught, not from shock, but from a relief I didn't know I needed. "What about the renovations he paid for?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Do you have records of shared expenses?" She replied, her tone practical. I nodded and handed over a folder filled with receipts, transfers, handwritten notes. She skimmed them, then leaned back with a small approving nod. "You've been preparing for this longer than you realized," she said softly. Walking out of her office, the world looked the same: cars, traffic, clouds. But something inside me had shifted, like a door quietly unlocking. That evening, I told Thai Lin everything. She sat up in her hospital bed, one eye still bandaged, her voice rough with emotion. "I don't want to be the reason your life falls apart," she whispered. "You're not," I said. "You're the reason I'm waking up." When she reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. A week later, I sent Elias a text, asking him to meet me at the lakeside cafe. The sky was pale gray when he walked in, brushing rain from his coat sleeves. He looked tired, annoyed, but still confident in the way he always was. I placed the engagement ring on the table between us. Its diamond caught the light, small and silent like a last breath. "We need to talk," I said, though my voice didn't shake this time. Elias leaned back, arms folded, eyes narrowing as if he already knew. "I'm ending this," I continued. "I can't marry someone who asks me to abandon myself." His laugh was sharp, incredulous. "All this because of your sister?" "No," I said. "All this because I finally heard myself." I slid the legal notice toward him, the paper whispering across the wood. "You have 30 days to move out of the house." His face drained of color, anger rising like a storm behind his eyes. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, each word like a blade. Maybe I would. But as I walked out into the rain, the air smelled like freedom, wet, raw, and honest. Nancy called me on a quiet evening, when the sky was fading into muted blue. Her name on the screen made my stomach tighten, but I answered anyway. "I need to tell you something about Elias," she said, voice unsteady but calm. She spoke of his father, a man who believed women were possessions, not people. A man who left bruises on skin and deeper ones on hearts, then walked away. For years, she shielded Elias from him, hid the darkest parts of their past. But 6 months ago, Elias found him again, sent messages, arranged secret meetings. "He's changing," she whispered. becoming more like him every day. I pressed my hand against the kitchen counter, breath caught in my throat. Nancy's voice broke when she said, "I couldn't stop my husband. I won't stay silent now." After the call ended, the house felt different, like the truth had cracked the walls. Days blurred into each other, as Elias drifted between anger and silence. His belongings still sat in boxes by the door, untouched, like silent accusations. At night, I sometimes heard the garage door open, then close again without a sound. I thought he was leaving. Instead, he stayed like a storm hovering above the rooftops. Then one night, everything shattered. A furious pounding on my front door jolted me awake. Through the security camera screen, Elias stood on the porch, rain soaking his hair. His voice was loud, slurred, full of hurt and rage. "You think you can just erase 6 years?" he shouted, fist slamming against the wood. "You owe me. Open the door, we need to talk." My hands shook as I dialed 911, whispering the address with trembling lips. Blue lights arrived just as the storm outside broke open in thunder. By the time police stepped onto the porch, Elias was gone, tires screeching into the night. The next morning, I filed for a restraining order at the courthouse. The officer handed me copies, the papers rough and final in my hands. 30 days became 14, then 7, his things slowly disappearing from the hallway. But peace didn't return, it just waited. 3 days later, my phone rang again. It was Mai, an old friend from college. Her voice was hushed, rushed, like she was afraid the words might cut her. "Elias has been arrested," she said. "He fought with his father in a bar last night. His father lay in the hospital with a head injury, sirens and blood and broken glass. They're charging him with assault," she finished, falling into silence. I sank to the floor beside my grandmother's rocking chair, tears burning but unshed. The man I loved was gone long before the handcuffs closed around his wrists. What remained was a stranger shaped like him, carrying every wound he never healed. And I knew then I couldn't save him. Some people have to walk through their own storm to see the sky again. The hospital smelled less sterile than before, softer, like healing instead of fear. Lynn sat by the window during her checkup, a thin scar beneath her eye patch. Light touched her gently, and for the first time in weeks, her smile reached her eyes. "I'm getting better," she said, and I believed her. On the drive home, the road seemed less heavy, as if the world had loosened its grip. The house was quiet when I returned, no footsteps, no tension vibrating in the walls. Boxes once filled with Elias things were gone, leaving spaces that felt both hollow and free. I stood in the doorway of the spare room, the one we once planned for a future child. The wallpaper, soft yellow with faded stars, still clung to the walls like a memory. I opened a can of paint and rolled a calm shade of blue over it, slow and deliberate. Each stroke wiped away a plan no longer meant for me. The house smelled of fresh paint and lemon soap, like a beginning instead of an end. In the evenings, friends started visiting again, carrying warm bread and quiet laughter. Lan brought flowers from her garden and placed them in the chipped vase on the table. "You're breathing again," she said softly, brushing dust from my shoulder. My mother began calling more, not to ask about wedding plans, but to ask if I'd eaten. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she said nothing, just breathed with me on the line. One morning, I found my grandmother's recipe box in the back of a drawer. Her handwriting curved across the yellowed cards, simple meals, soft wisdom. I spent the afternoon baking scones, the kitchen warm with butter and vanilla. When the timer rang, I cried without warning, not from sadness, but from release. Slowly, I reclaimed the spaces Elias had filled with his rules and expectations. The living room, walls now held my paintings instead of his photographs. The heavy curtains he chose were replaced with white linen that let sunlight breathe. The bed no longer felt like a battlefield, but a place I could sleep without armor. Lynn visited one weekend, still healing but standing on her own. She walked through each room, touching surfaces as though blessing them back to life. "This house feels like you now," she whispered, pride shimmering in her voice. We drank tea on the porch, the wooden swing creaking beneath us like it remembered. Wind rustled through the trees, and for the first time, the sound didn't hurt. My stepfather fixed the loose board on the back deck and left his tools neatly stacked. My mother planted jasmine by the fence, saying roots make things stay. Every act of care stitched another piece of my life back together. Some nights, I still lay awake, listening for storms that never came. But instead of fear, there was a quiet calm waiting in the dark. I no longer felt like I was surviving. I was learning to live again. My heart was bruised, yes, but it was beating in its own rhythm. And this time, it was beating for me. 6 months passed like pages turning in a book. I finally wanted to keep reading. The house no longer echoed with silence, but hummed with quiet life and small joys. Morning light spilled across the kitchen tiles, and I found peace in simple routines. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Elias, forwarded by the lawyer. He wrote that he was in therapy, working, trying to change, living in another city. He said he was sorry, that he understood if I never replied. I folded the letter and placed it in my grandmother's wooden recipe box. Not to remember him, but to remember how far I had come. A second envelope came the same day, handwriting unfamiliar yet careful. It was from Nancy, thanking me for choosing truth over comfort. She wrote, "You showed him a line he could no longer cross." Her words didn't hurt, they felt like closure. I didn't cry, I didn't smile, I simply breathed. Autumn crept into the air, cool and golden, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. Thai Lin stood at my door one morning, with a stack of blueprints in her hands. "I bought a plot of land 3 streets over," she said, eyes bright with quiet pride. She was building a home, close and permanent, roots like our grandmother once dreamed. That evening, we sat on the porch, sorting through old photographs. Our childhood smiles, scraped knees, and sunburned summers stared back at us. Elias' shadow no longer lingered in the corners of my mind. When his name came up, it was like mentioning distant rain on another horizon. Some storms move on without asking if you're ready. And sometimes, you survive them without realizing you've already begun to heal. One crisp morning, I hosted dinner for the people who stayed. Lan brought homemade wine. My mother brought laughter. My stepfather brought fresh fish. We filled the dining table with stories, not expectations. No one raised their voice. No one measured my worth in obedience. The chair that once felt like a reminder of absence now felt simply empty. And that emptiness didn't hurt. It made room. Later, I found the folded wedding plans at the back of a drawer. Venue ideas, guest lists, a dress design with lace sleeves and pearl buttons. I placed them in a box, not with anger, but with quiet gratitude. They were part of who I was, not who I needed to be. Before bed, I stood in front of the mirror and saw someone I recognized at last. Not a bride, not a caretaker, not someone waiting to be chosen, but someone who chose herself. A week later, I received a small card from a local architect I'd met at a cafe. Just a name, a number, and a note. "If you ever want to design something new." I didn't rush to call. I simply placed it on the table next to fresh flowers. Future didn't feel like a question anymore. It felt like a doorway I could walk through when I was ready. The night air was cool as I stood on the porch, lanterns glowing softly. I whispered into the dark, not for anyone else to hear. "I am free." And for the first time, the word didn't feel lonely. It felt like home. A year later, sunlight drifted through my kitchen window like a familiar song. Dust floated in the air, quiet and peaceful, no longer heavy with memory. Fresh scones cooled on the counter, the recipe written in my grandmother's hand. Thai Lin sat across from me, her right eye clear and bright beneath soft lashes. We shared coffee and silence, not the kind that hurts, but the kind that heals. The house no longer felt like a battlefield, but like a place that had learned to breathe. I led her through each room, showing the soft pink walls, the linen curtains, the quiet corners. "This is your home," she said, and for the first time I believed it. Outside, the garden bloomed again, jasmine climbing the fence like whispered prayers. The swing on the porch creaked in the breeze, steady and familiar. I thought of all the storms that once shook these walls, and how none remained. Some scars had faded, others stayed, but none of them defined me anymore. I wasn't waiting for someone to stay, or begging someone not to leave. I was simply here, whole, standing in the life I rebuilt. And I finally understood what home meant. It wasn't a place. It was the moment I chose myself and never looked back.